Welcome to a new Energy Podcast. I'm your host, JP Warren. This episode, I'm going to do my very best to try to kind of give you the key takeaways that we had from our Crue Club Operator Roundtable in August of 2025. This was when Dan Ramito, the managing director of Pickering Energy Partners, came to the table and led a fantastic conversation on the energy, power, and water paradigm for Texas. How the U.S. and the world, how it's changing, and it's continuing to change. And this was a very high-level conversation. Dan, who actually I met through LinkedIn, just seeing his material, he does all these talks about kind of like bridging energy expectations and energy realities, how kind of, poor energy policy, how it impacts actual, consumers, and what's really driving the energy policies and kind of the shifts when it comes to water, power, electricity, and everything like that. So I loved how Dan led the discussion. And again, this is a very high level conversation. This is probably about the 7th or 8th time I've started this podcast, and I just kind of get tripped up because I'm trying to think about where to start, how to talk about it. But I'm just going to base the conversation off my notes because I think that's probably the best way to do about it. Not try to fill it in too much and just kind of give you the key takeaways of what we talked about around the table. Again, Dan Ramito had a fantastic conversation. I want to thank everyone for being there. The DRAS Command, Liberty Drilling Services, Fortis Energy Services, Volant Products, Mesa Solutions, and I think that's it. So pretty much the whole point of this conversation is Dan has been speaking at all these different events, whether they're inside the industry or outside the industry, when it comes to kind of what the energy demand and how it's changing, kind of whether it's water resources, electricity, what's going to be required with all these new data centers and AI, and what's required for all this stuff. So again, high level stuff. Some of this is kind of outside my realm, but I'm going to do my best. I'm using my notes to kind of clarify on what we kind of talked about. So to set the scene real quick. So there's a lot of conversation when Dan first stepped on the plate about when he was having these energy reality conversations. He was leading a lot of conversations when it comes to ESG, not the virtue ESG and all that stuff that everyone signs off for, but pretty much how investors respond to ESG. He was spending a lot of time in Europe at the time, and he was seeing a huge push from investment firms, the investment sentiment when it came to investing in companies. And ESG kind of became a huge topic of conversation. That's kind of where he settled into this. Now it's ESG versus sustainability. So don't conflate these two things. All right. So decarbonization is increasingly framed as resource efficiencies under constraint. All right. So think we're trying to use less waste and less stuff while kind of keeping the lights on, keeping the consistent energy power. All right. The U.S. track record, since about 1975, the U.S. reduced emissions intensity. We reduced our emission intensity by about 40%, while the GDP per capita grew about 40%. So we decoupled growth from emissions better than most actual nations. All right. So I guess we got richer with polluting less per dollar. All right. And the global supply chain reality is China controls about 80% of wind and solar supply chains. All right. While they're also still building to this day, a lot of coal plants, a lot of nuclear plants. So again, just because China is converting to renewables, that doesn't mean that the renewable industry is in a safe spot just because China controlling 80% of the market right there. And again, China is not just because charts might be showing going green or switching more renewables. That also doesn't take away the reality that coal is powering that country, that hydrocarbons are still an essential part in their growth, in their GDP. So let's kind of dive into this real quick. The first segment we kind of talked about was the data center wave, kind of how power and water are affecting this whole data center. I'm sure you're seeing either headlines or maybe you've driven past these huge data centers. They're just enormous buildings housing all these computers. And so what does it take to actually kind of keep one of these things up and running? So in Texas power, it peaked about 85 gigawatts. All right. But the future demand projections point the Texas power need to be 150 gigawatts by 2030. So in 5 years, we're about double that the power demand. All right. So in 5 years, we're going from 85 gigawatts and it's going to be needed to be 150 gigawatts. All right. So that's an insane amount of power that's going to be needed. All right. Water. So for a single hyperscale data center, the water used is about 164 million gallons a year. And I'm using my notes for this just because there's so much information I think is very fascinating. So with U.S. sites growing from about 500 today, at about 2030, we're going to be about 2.5 times where we're at today. So that water that's going to be needed, that could be equal to 400,000 Olympic-sized pools, all right, per year. That's insane. So 400,000 Olympic-sized pools full of water are going to be needed to power these new AI data centers, which is fascinating, all right? And there's a lot of pressure right now with a lot of communities, a lot of NIMBY mentality, the whole not in my backyard. So they're talking about, a lot of these communities that they want to set up these huge data centers. There's a lot of pushback because whether it's the noise, whether it's the land footprint, whether it's the water resource that's going to be needed or the electricity that's going to be needed, but also it's another thing too where it's not creating as many jobs as people are projecting or promoting. So that's also been a lot of pushback from these rural communities. I think when it comes to energy, this whole NIMBY mentality, and we're going to talk about this in another podcast because we just got back from Colorado with Mike Umbro with California's for Energy and Science. It's very interesting when it comes to energy, this NIMBY mentality, but I get it. It makes sense. But just because we have a NIMBY mentality when we're talking about energy, but that doesn't mean we need to offsite our energy production. I'm getting my head of myself when it comes to the next one because, California, it's a very NIMBY mentality. They started shutting down production. They started closing down refineries, but it doesn't take away from the energy reality that they still consuming a certain amount of barrels of fossil fuels, of hydrocarbons. I don't even hate the word fossil fuels, but they're still consuming a certain amount of energy. And where are they getting that? They're getting it from Iraq, Venezuela, Russia, all these outsourced places because it's not in my backyard. But is that the best thing environmentally? Is that the best thing for countries, for communities? Probably not. We'll dive into that in another Energy Crew podcast. So now we're talking about nuclear thermal plants. So thermal plants use about 5 gallons of water per kilowatt for cooling. This is pretty much of a common figure. All right. So we have a couple questions here too throughout this episode. Where do you see the biggest constraint when it comes to building these AI data centers, these data centers? Is it going to be the power supply of things? Is it going to be the water? Is it going to be kind of the social license that we have to make with these rural communities? What do you see the biggest kind of, obstacle, and how do we kind of break through that? And I guess another thing to think about is what messaging would work best for these communities when they're trying to build these huge data centers. All right. So the second segment we got into is how the investment community is having more stringent measurements. So there's a big thing about measuring, greenhouse gases, measuring stuff like that. So the current system is kind of what we discussed around the table. It's kind of broken a little bit. All right. Right now, a lot of companies are reporting emissions using factors. And pretty much this is just guessing kind of your emissions from some formula that was created on an Excel spreadsheet. All right. So it's pretty much people are tracking their emissions with pretty much a government approved spreadsheet with some formulas in it. So does that mean it's necessarily accurate? Does that mean it's actually telling the story that kind of is the reality of what's going on when it's producing energy? Probably not, all right? The problem is that these are just guesses. They're not actual real measurements. So policymakers, insurers, and investors really don't trust this. I mean, do you trust something that's that you're just kind of maybe guessing something through, especially when it comes to how you maybe bring in investments or pretty much maybe how you tell your story to the world? Probably not. So there was a conversation on we probably need better measurements when we are measuring all these the greenhouse gases that we produce. So what does good look like when it comes to kind of measuring what is this with air quality? So what does good look like? So around the table, it was bottom up. So how do we put sensors kind of around the locations, around the sites to kind of measure, have continuous measuring right there, and also top down. So these are flyovers, these are satellites measuring stuff. And there's also, we were discussing kind of having a reconciliation of kind of this. So when you combine the bottom up, so again, the sensors are on the ground, and the top down to get the planes flying in the air, you kind of reconcile these numbers, all right? So when you can reconcile this and prove your actual numbers, that's what the investment community is looking for. That's kind of more of a trustworthy number versus saying, hey, this is what our spreadsheet says, all right? So one analogy is like checking your bank account with both your receipt log and the bank's official statement. So saying, hey, listen, if those match, then you can trust that number. All right. So, so there's some frameworks that are kind of pushing this shift to kind of have this reconciliation when it comes to these two numbers. The OGPM 2.0, which is a UN program. Level 3 is you're still using estimates. You're still cranking away in these spreadsheets. Level 4 is that you start measuring directly. You're doing the top down or bottom up. All right. Level 5, you've reconciled both and prove your accuracy. All right. This level 5, it shows progress towards measuring you can bank on, aka measuring for investors to invest in your company. All right. The MIQ certification that adds audits and consultants to check your gas as low methane. So the cost can be about 20 cent, 0.2 to 0.25 MMBTU, but premiums for selling certified gas are hit or miss. So again, the ROI is not guaranteed for that. So why does this matter beyond the ESG buzzwords and all that stuff we're talking about? Number one, insurers. Insurers, all right? Insurers are starting to demand measurement and underwriting. Why? Well, that's because they don't want lawsuits down the road for covering a company with leaky operations. And investors are kind of tired of the whole trust me data, right? The whole trust me, oh, this is what we're doing. Trust me, trust me, trust me. Investors are kind of getting away from that. They want hard numbers. They want stuff that they can rely on. They want information that they can trust, all right? And with operators, when operators measure better, all right, you can prove that you're clean. You can prove that that you're clean, which grants you access to capital, which grants you access to insurance and avoids being you kind of boxed out of capital or permits, all right? So again, so this is something to think about, some talking points. If an operator was to start tomorrow, all right, and starts drilling wells tomorrow, what's the bare minimum tech stack, sensors, drones, surveys that would win their trust, right? So how would you actually, if you were going to start tomorrow, what would you do to kind of start building the investor community's trust, the insurers community's trust, all right? And how do you explain to a generalist investor that measurement isn't just about being green, it's about protecting cash flow and lowering risk? This is an interesting conversation to have, especially in the oil and gas industry. How do you actually have these conversations about energy realities, how you be environmental stewards and still attract investments? Listen, if I could answer that question, I wouldn't be doing an Energy Crew podcast in my office at the house, all right? The next segment we moved into is kind of the tech bros and how the bridge power and SMRs, all right? So the tech POV. So tech bros are actually viewing natural gas as a bridge power between dirty fossil fuels and clean renewables. Again, that's the biggest marketing BS out there in my opinion. But natural gas is a bridge power when people are trying to build these SMRs, which is these small modular nuclear reactors, pretty much these small nuclear source of energy that can kind of run these data centers or locations and all that stuff. Again, these SMRs will be off grid, which is great. So it won't pull on the existing tired grid that a lot of places are having right now. So some hyperscalers are seeking dedicated energy generation or power generation to avoid grid battles. All right. So again, think about Texas, ERCOT, think about California. There's a lot of strain on the grid. So these companies are looking for, again, another source of energy to keep these huge data centers running. All right. So what's the timeline between getting these SMRs, these nuclear reactors, these nuclear, not reactors, whatever, these SMRs online? Some people are saying 5 years. However, there's some people are saying it's going to take a little bit longer than 5 years because we don't have the manufacturing, we don't have the licensing, there's some environmental permits we might have to go through. But again, what's the talk out there? No one really knows. With some people saying 5 years, some people are saying, a lot longer than that. So no one really knows right now. But the thing is, though, it is on people's radar. So that means people are probably talking about moving towards that direction. So again, this whole mentality of like, oh, well, it'll be here down the road, the technology will be here. It's people working on the technology today. All right. So there's some grid constraints too. T&D bottlenecks make behind the meter, the on-site power case is stronger for both data centers and some industrial loads. And there's a price pressure. Operators report power costs climbing. So one example is one company was dealing with about 0.04 cents per kilowatt. Within 5 years, that 0.04 went to 10 to 12 kilowatts per hour in about 5 years. So that's squeezing the field economics of everything going out there. So it's a lot. It's a lot right now. So there's a lot of challenges out there when it comes to meeting power demands, but also what does it mean to the resources, such as water, such as everything like that. So local communities. All right. So what's the segment D, which is the capital messaging, what the story leads. Number one, the investor memory is that the shale companies, operating the shale plays, are great at burning cash and not bringing returns back. All right. So that's still a memory that a lot of investment communities have, is that shale is great at burning capital. However, the story must translate to cash growth and margins, not just the engineering detail. Our industry is obviously run by a lot of engineers out there, and engineers are very data driven, very stuck to the data, stuck to the points. But that's not the story that drives people to invest. That's not the stories that change people's perception when it comes to energy, when it comes to power. So again, maybe changing the story a little bit. All right. So what is the operator playbook? So how do operators start leading these conversations? Are they leading with efficiency and transparent measurement wins? Kind of what are they doing out there when it comes to measuring their GHD or anything like that, or the methane? So again, lower methane intensity and power cost control. And again, even the policy mood is shifting. Even with deregulation rhetoric, agencies want proof that the industry can self-raise standards, otherwise regulation returns. So as an industry, if we're not taking proactive steps on how we're actually regulating ourselves, what we're reporting, how we're collecting data, then we're leaving that to other people to come in and kind of regulate our industry ourselves. So again, that's just something that, again, we need to take and be maybe a little more proactive. I think historically our industry has done a pretty poor job on being proactive when it comes to telling our story, talking about the benefits of energy and the benefits of power, and even just kind of defending false claims around us. So again, how are we as an industry having these conversations to the investment community, right? Is it we just talking data points, or are we telling a story? Again, I think it's shifting into telling a story that's going to have a lot more stickiness. All right. So one question that I have here is, so when you're thinking about your company, whether you're an operator, service company, or maybe you're not even in the industry, you're just out there kind of listening because you dig these podcasts. What would be your 90-second pitch, right? What would be your 90-second pitch when it comes to cash, growth, and risk controls? Like what's in, what's out, right? And if premiums for certified gas aren't reliable yet, what's the ROIC case for measurement anyway, right? Insurance, access to capital, permitting, or community license. All right. So some quick facts to kind of wrap this stuff up, which I thought was interesting. The Texas load is about 85 gigawatts now, with 150 gigawatts projected in 5 years. So think about that. Think about the winters we have. Think about the strain on the ERCOT power system and how it's tied into a lot of renewables right now. So that's going to be a huge challenge for just Texas alone. But there's a lot of other grids out there that are kind of outdated infrastructure. Water and data centers. Currently, it's about 164 million gallons per year. It's in 2030. That's going to be 2.5 times that. Again, equating to about 400,000 Olympic pools combined. That's going to be needed. All right. Thermal power water uses about 5 gallons per kilowatt. The U.S. is decoupling. Again, 40% lower carbon intensity since 1975 with 40% higher capita GDP. All right, that's pretty impressive. China renewables. China controls about 80% of the supply chain when it comes to renewables. All right, so again, they're still building coal. They're still building nuclear. So again, going all renewables might leave you in a bind, because with China controlling 80% of the supply, what can that do to supply chains, to prices, to reliability, to technology? All right. And then certification of economics. MIQ can cost 0.20 to 0.25 MMBTU. God, see, again, these conversations are way over my head. That's why I'm reading my notes. But again, there's additional costs when it comes to kind of getting insured if you aren't providing actual data, top down, bottom up. All right. So let's see. So at the end of the day, I want to thank everyone for being at the table. I would advise, if you're really kind of looking to understand more about when it comes to data centers, when it comes to kind of the resources needed for these data centers, and kind of where we are at a bottleneck when it comes to a lot of these discussions, link up with Dan Ramito. Check him out on LinkedIn. He's got some great material out there when it comes to kind of these realities that we're kind of faced right now as a nation. He does a great, 30,000 foot geopolitical view, but he also ties it back to a lot of local areas where these challenges are present today, and they're going to continue to be growing unless we start having these conversations to change them. So again, we are in an interesting bind, and I was blown away about the amount of resources that it takes for these huge data centers. And it's one of those things too, this NIMBY mentality, everyone's utilizing AI. Everyone needs power. Everyone needs to have consistent, reliable power. So how do we actually become energy maximists and do it in a responsible way? So I want to thank everyone at the table. I want to thank all of you for listening out there. I hope this made sense. I didn't feel that confident with this podcast, but again, I felt that this was such an interesting conversation. I had to get it out there. That's why I was based off my notes. But again, hope you enjoyed this. Again, thank you for tuning in to Energy Crew Podcast. That's where we're just kind of having conversations, whether with industry leaders talking about kind of their journey or just kind of what's happening in in the energy space today. Yeah, I think that's it. I think I want to thank everyone for tuning in and having these conversations again. Yeah, I guess thanks for tuning in. We'll see you on the next Energy Crew podcast. Again, yeah, as you can tell, this one was not, I wasn't the most confident with this one. Even to wrap it up, I felt like I've been spinning. But thank you out there. Thank you, Dan Ramito, and everyone else out there for tuning in. And again, we have some energy issues at hand, but again, through conversations, through getting together with a lot of smart people and talking about this, maybe we can kind of start moving forward and getting out of these energy binds.